Jonas Whitaker had lived alone in Monument Valley for 23 years, watching the red sandstone towers rise like cathedral spires from the desert floor, while the world beyond his fences slowly forgot he existed. At 61, he was as weathered and enduring as the ancient rocks that surrounded his small ranch, his face carved by wind and sun into planes and angles that mirrored the landscape he called home. The year was 1892, and the frontier was closing, but here in this remote corner where Arizona and Utah territories met, time seemed to move differently, measured not by clocks and calendars, but by the slow dance of seasons and the patient erosion of stone. His ranch was modest, even by frontier standards, a sturdy log house built into the shelter of a red rock cliff, a barn that had seen better years, corrals that held a few horses, and cattle hardy enough to survive on sparse vegetation and precious water. The nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, the nearest town twice that distance across desert that could kill the unprepared or the unlucky. Jonas had chosen this isolation deliberately, fleeing from memories of mistakes that had made civilized life unbearable. The Civil War had taken his youth. The death of his wife and daughter from influenza had taken his heart, and the years since had taken everything else except his stubborn determination to endure whatever trials a harsh country might present. He had learned to find contentment in solitude, deriving satisfaction from the simple rhythms of ranch work and the austere beauty of a landscape that demanded nothing from him except respect for its power and patience with its moods. His only companions were the animals he tended and the ravens that nested in the cliff face behind his house, intelligent birds that had learned to associate his presence with occasional scraps of food and had grown bold enough to perch near his porch during their daily conversations about weather, water, and the small dramas of survival that occupied most of their mutual attention. Jonas had grown comfortable with silence, finding in it a peace that human voices had never been able to provide. The sound of his own footsteps, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the distant cry of a hunting hawk, these had become the entire symphony of his existence, and he convinced himself that he needed nothing more. But on this particular afternoon, as the summer heat shimmered across the valley floor and the shadows of the great stone monuments began to lengthen toward evening, something was about to disrupt the careful equilibrium that Jonas had maintained for more than 2 decades. He was mending fence in the south pasture, replacing posts that had been weakened by the previous winter storms, when he first noticed a figure moving along the ancient trail that wound between the towering rocks. At first, he thought it might be a lost traveler or perhaps one of the occasional prospectors who still searched the region for minerals that had thus far proven more elusive than profitable. But as the figure drew closer, Jonas could see that this was someone in genuine distress, a young woman moving with the unsteady gait of someone pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. She was Native American, probably Navajo judging by her clothing and the direction from which she had come, and she was clearly in desperate need of help. Her dress was torn and stained, her feet were bare and bleeding from walking across the rocky ground, and her dark hair hung in tangled strings around a face that was gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Most telling of all, she moved with the careful desperation of someone who had been running from something and was now approaching the absolute end of her strength and resources. The young woman reached Jonas's fence line just as her remaining strength finally gave out. She managed to touch the wooden rails with trembling fingers, as if that contact represented some kind of symbolic sanctuary, before her legs buckled and she collapsed in the dust beside the weathered post that marked the boundary of his property. The fall was complete and sudden, the kind of total surrender that spoke of a body and spirit pushed far beyond their natural limits. Jonas dropped his tools and ran toward her, his isolation-stiffened joints protesting the sudden exertion, but his basic human decency overriding any concerns about his own comfort or convenience. As he knelt beside her unconscious form, Jonas could see that she was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with the fine bone structure and bronze complexion that marked her as one of the dying, the people who called themselves Navajo and who had inhabited this region for countless generations before white settlers arrived with their claims and boundaries. Her traditional dress, though torn and dusty, showed evidence of careful craftsmanship and the kind of attention to detail that spoke of family pride and cultural knowledge that had been passed down through generations of skilled women. But it was also clear that she had been traveling hard and fast, probably for days, under conditions that had taken a severe toll on her physical condition. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and showed signs of exhaustion that suggested she had been pushing herself far beyond normal human limits in order to reach whatever destination she had been seeking. Without hesitation, Jonas lifted her in his arms, surprised by how light she was despite her height. Clearly, she had been living on inadequate food for some time. He carried her toward his house, noting as he did so the way she clutched a small leather pouch even in unconsciousness, suggesting that whatever was inside it was important enough to protect even when awareness had fled. The interior of Jonas's house reflected his solitary lifestyle, clean and functional but spare, with few decorations or comforts beyond the basic necessities of frontier living. He had a guest room that had not been used in years, a remnant from the time when it still hoped that visitors might occasionally break the monotony of his isolation. Now it would serve a more important purpose than simple hospitality. Jonas laid the young woman on the bed and began the careful process of assessment and care that he had learned during his years as a cavalry medic in the war. She was severely dehydrated, but showed no obvious signs of serious injury beyond the cuts and bruises that would be expected from someone who had been traveling rough country on foot. Her breathing was steady and her pulse, though rapid from exhaustion, suggested that she would recover if given proper food, water, and rest. He brought water first, supporting her head and allowing her to drink slowly as consciousness gradually returned. Her dark eyes opened with the instant alertness of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly, but when she saw Jonas's weathered face and the simple interior of his cabin, some of the tension went out of her body. "Easy," Jonas said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse but gentle with the tone he had once used to calm frightened horses. "You're safe here. You collapsed at my fence, and I brought you inside." The young woman tried to sit up, then thought better of it as dizziness reminded her of her weakened condition. "Water," she whispered, the word carrying the desperate need of someone who had been without adequate hydration for far too long. Jonas helped her drink more, noting how she rationed herself despite her obvious thirst, a sign that she understood the importance of not overwhelming a system that had been deprived of fluids for an extended period. As the young woman regained her strength sufficiently to speak, Jonas found himself faced with the complex question of how much to ask about her circumstances and how much to simply accept without demanding explanations that she might not be ready or able to provide. His years of solitude had not diminished his understanding of human nature, and everything about her behavior suggested that she was fleeing from some kind of serious trouble, the kind that could potentially follow her to his ranch and involve him in complications that he had spent 23 years trying to avoid. But looking at her obvious exhaustion and the trust she was beginning to show in accepting his help, Jonas found that his curiosity was less important than his obligation to provide sanctuary to someone who clearly needed it desperately. "My name is Jonas Whitaker," he said simply, offering the basic courtesy of introduction without demanding reciprocation. "This is my ranch, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to get your strength back." The young woman studied his face carefully, clearly trying to assess whether this unexpected kindness came with hidden costs or expectations. "I am Ayana," she said finally, giving him the English version of a name that probably had deeper meaning in her native language. "I am grateful for your help." Jonas noticed that she didn't offer a family name or any information about where she had come from or where she was going, and he respected that reticence by not pressing for details that she obviously preferred to keep private. Instead, he focused on the practical matters of ensuring her recovery, preparing nourishing food, providing clean clothes that had belonged to his late wife, and creating an environment where she could rest without fear of disturbance or threat. Over the following days, as Ayana regained her physical strength, small details of her story began to emerge through casual conversation rather than direct questioning. She was Navajo, as Jonas had suspected, from one of the bands that lived in the mountainous regions to the south and east of Monument Valley. She had been traveling for 6 days, mostly at night to avoid detection, carrying only what she could fit in the small leather pouch that she guarded so carefully. Most importantly, she was clearly intelligent and well-educated, speaking English with precision that suggested formal schooling rather than just casual contact with white communities. "You went to school?" Jonas observed one evening as they sat on his porch watching the spectacular sunset that painted the monument rocks in shades of gold and crimson. "Eastern school, probably." Ayana nodded, her expression showing a mixture of pride and sadness. Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. For years of learning to be something other than what I was born to be. The bitter edge in her voice told Jonas much about her experience at the federal institution that was supposedly designed to civilize Native American children by separating them from their families and cultures. He had heard stories about such places, some good, some terrible, but Ayana's tone suggested that her time there had been more punishment than education. "And now you're going home?" Jonas asked gently. "Or running from something?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the last light of day was fading into the deep blue of desert night. "Running from the kind of people who think that education means forgetting who you are," she said finally, "and trying to get home to people who might think that education means I've forgotten who I am." It was a complex answer that revealed the difficult position of Native Americans who had been caught between two worlds, educated in white institutions, but expected to return to traditional communities that might view such education with suspicion, while also being rejected by white society that saw them as permanently other regardless of their accomplishments or assimilation. As Ayana's strength returned and she became more comfortable in Jonas's presence, she began to reveal the true nature of her mission and the precious burden she carried in the leather pouch that never left her side. What she showed him was both beautiful and politically explosive, a collection of documents, photographs, and traditional artifacts that told the story of systematic abuse and cultural destruction at the Carlisle School and other federal institutions designed to civilize Native American children. The documents included official correspondence between school administrators and government officials that revealed the true purposes behind the educational programs, not provide genuine learning opportunities, but to destroy tribal identities and create a generation of Native Americans who would be psychologically separated from their own people and cultures. The photographs were even more damning, showing children who had been forcibly removed from their families and subjected to harsh conditions that amounted to cultural genocide disguised as education. I worked as a translator and secretary for school administrators. Ayana explained as Jonas examined the evidence she had risked her life to preserve. They thought I was just another successfully assimilated Indian who could help them communicate with new students and their families. They never suspected that I was documenting everything I saw and copying every document I could access. The artifacts she carried were equally significant. Sacred objects that had been confiscated from students and supposedly destroyed, but which Ayana had secretly preserved as evidence of the systematic attempt to eradicate Native American spiritual practices. Each item had been carefully documented with information about which tribe it came from, which student it had belonged to, and what its cultural significance had been before it was stolen and hidden away. "These things belong to families throughout the country," Ayana said, her voice thick with emotion as she handled objects that represented not just cultural heritage, but the spiritual connections that bound Native American communities together across time and space. Children were forced to watch as their most precious possessions were burned or buried, told that such things were evil and had to be destroyed for their own good. Jonas felt a growing anger as he realized the scope and systematic nature of what Ayana was describing. This wasn't just education with a cultural bias. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy the identity and spiritual foundation of an entire people, carried out under the banner of Christian charity and federal authority. The evidence that Ayana had collected could expose the truth about institutions that claimed to be helping Native American children while actually working to erase their cultural identity entirely. "What do you plan to do with all this?" Jonas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Take it to the territorial capital," Ayana replied with quiet determination. "Present the federal investigators who might be willing to expose what's really happening in these schools and return these sacred objects to the families they were stolen from, so that healing can begin for communities that have been told their children are dead when they're actually being held prisoner and tortured." The mission was both noble and extremely dangerous. The people responsible for the abuses Ayana had documented had significant political power and economic interests that would be threatened by exposure of their crimes. They would certainly make every effort to prevent her from reaching the territorial authorities, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence and intimidation to protect their positions. "They've been hunting me since I left Carlisle 2 weeks ago," Ayana admitted. "Federal marshals, school officials, hire trackers, all claiming that I stole government property and violated my student contract. But what I really did was threaten a system that's making certain people very wealthy while destroying the lives of children and families. Jonas understood that by harboring Ayanna and helping her with her mission, he would be making himself a target of the same forces that were pursuing her. His isolated ranch, which had been a refuge from the complications of the outside world, would become a battlefield in a conflict that reached to the highest levels of territorial and federal government. On Ayanna's third night at the ranch, Jonas began to notice signs that their isolation was no longer absolute. Small things at first. Tracks near the creek that didn't belong to his animals, the unusual behavior of his horses, and a complete absence of the ravens that normally roost in the cliff face behind his house. His years of frontier living had taught him to read such signs as warnings of approaching danger, and he began to take precautions that reflected his growing certainty that hostile forces were moving into the area. He checked his weapons, secured additional water and food supplies, and began varying his daily routines to make surveillance more difficult for anyone who might be watching from the surrounding rocks and ridges. Most importantly, he discussed with Ayanna the possibility that they might need to leave the ranch quickly if pursuit arrived before she was strong enough to continue her journey to the territorial capital. But what Jonas didn't yet understand was that they were being watched by more than just the federal agents and hired trackers who were hunting Ayanna. Word of her presence at the isolated ranch had spread through the informal networks that connected Native American communities throughout the region, carried by traders, travelers, and a complex system of signals and messages that allowed tribes to communicate across vast distances without using the telegraph and postal systems controlled by white authorities. The response to this news was unlike anything that had occurred in the recorded history of the American Southwest. Representatives from dozens of different tribes, not just Navajo, but also Hopi, Apache, Ute, and even some Lakota, who had traveled hundreds of miles, were converging on Monument Valley to bear witness to what they saw as a pivotal moment in the struggle to preserve Native American culture and identity. These were not war parties in traditional sense, but something far more significant. Entire communities mobilizing to protect one young woman who carried evidence that could expose the systematic destruction of their people's heritage and provide legal grounds for demanding justice and reparations. The scale and coordination of this gathering was unprecedented, representing a level of intertribal cooperation that government officials had always insisted was impossible. But shared outrage over the treatment of their children had created bonds that transcended the traditional boundaries and conflicts that had historically divided different Native American peoples. As night fell over Monument Valley, Jonas and Ayanna were unaware that they were surrounded by the largest gathering of Native Americans in the region since the federal government had implemented its reservation system. The watchers were positioned with such skill and discipline that their presence was virtually invisible to anyone unfamiliar with reading the subtle signs of human presence in natural settings. But they were there, hundreds of them, arranged in overlapping circles of observation and protection that would make it impossible for federal agents to approach the ranch without being detected and potentially confronted by overwhelming numbers of determined defenders. The gathering included not just warriors, but also medicine men and women, tribal elders, and representatives of the traditional councils that still maintain authority within Native American communities despite federal attempts to replace them with government-appointed agents. These were people who understood that Ayanna's mission represented more than just one woman's attempt to expose criminal behavior. It was a test of whether their people would be able to preserve any meaningful connection to their heritage in the face of systematic cultural genocide. As Jonas prepared for sleep, checking his weapons one final time and listening for any sounds that might indicate approaching danger, he had no idea that his ranch had become the center of what would soon be recognized as one of the most significant Native American gatherings in the history of the American West. Jonas woke in the pre-dawn darkness to a sensation he couldn't immediately identify, a subtle vibration in the ground beneath his house, so faint that it might have been imagination or perhaps a distant earthquake. But as he became more fully alert, he realized that the vibration was rhythmic and purposeful, like the synchronized movement of many feet, or perhaps the muffled beat of ceremonial drums. The sound was coming from all directions simultaneously, surrounding his ranch with a presence that was unmistakably human, but unlike anything he had experienced in his 23 years of desert solitude. He dressed quickly and quietly, checking his weapons and moving carefully toward the window that provided the best view of the valley floor and the approaches to his property. What he saw when he peered through the glass made him question his sanity and wonder if exhaustion and stress had finally caused him to begin hallucinating. The familiar landscape of Monument Valley had been transformed overnight into something that belonged more to legend than to reality. As far as the eye could see in every direction, the desert floor was occupied by Native Americans, men, women, children, and elders representing what appeared to be dozens of different tribes and communities. They were arranged in carefully ordered formations that spoke of military precision and ceremonial significance, but they were also clearly peaceful in their intentions, carrying traditional weapons and ceremonial objects rather than the modern rifles and ammunition that would have characterized a war party. The sight was both magnificent and deeply moving, a living demonstration of the diversity and unity of Native American peoples, gathered together in common cause despite the geographical and cultural differences that normally kept their communities separate. Jonas could see Navajo in their traditional dress standing beside Hopi farmers, Apache warriors sharing space with Ute hunters, and even some Plains Indians whose distinctive clothing and horse gear indicated that they had traveled hundreds of miles to be present for whatever was about to unfold. But what struck him most powerfully was the absolute silence that characterized this enormous gathering. Hundreds of people, perhaps thousands when he considered those who might be positioned beyond the limits of his vision, were maintaining complete quiet despite the logistical complexity of their assembly and emotional significance of their presence. It was a silence that spoke of discipline, purpose, and shared understanding that transcended the need for verbal communication. Ayanna appeared beside him at the window, her own eyes wide with amazement and recognition as she took in the scope of the gathering that had materialized during the night. "They came," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "All of them. Every tribe, every family that has children stolen by the schools. They came to bear witness." Jonas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert's morning coolness as he began to understand the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a demonstration of support for one young woman's mission. It was a formal assembly of Native American peoples, united in their determination to protect their cultural heritage and demand justice for the crimes that had been committed against their children and communities. The presence of so many representatives from different tribes created a political situation that would be impossible for federal authorities to ignore or suppress through their usual methods of intimidation and violence. How did they know? Jonas asked quietly. How did word spread so quickly? "The same way our people have always communicated when survival was at stake," Ayanna replied. "Smoke signals, message runners, traders who carry more than just goods from community to community. When something threatens all of us, the old networks activate faster than any telegraph or postal system the government has ever created." As the sun began to rise over the eastern rim of the valley, painting the red rocks in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the assembled Native Americans began to move with the synchronized precision of people participating in a sacred ceremony. But they were not advancing toward Jonas's ranch. Instead, they were arranging themselves in formal council formation, creating a vast amphitheater in the desert that would allow representatives from each tribe to speak and be heard by the entire gathering. What unfolded as the sun climbed higher into the desert sky was unprecedented in the modern history of Native American and federal government relations. The gathering in Monument Valley represented the largest intertribal council to assemble since the implementation of the reservation system, and its purpose went far beyond simple protest or demonstration. These people had come to create a formal record of the crimes that had been committed against their children and communities, to bear witness to the evidence that Ayanna had risked her life to preserve, and to establish a united front that would make it impossible for federal authorities to continue their policies of cultural destruction while facing organized resistance from across the entire Native American community. The council was conducted according to traditional protocols that were ancient when European settlers first arrived in North America, but which have been adapted to address the unprecedented challenges posed by systematic attempts to destroy Native American identity and culture. Speakers from each tribe took turns presenting testimony about their experiences with federal education programs, government agents, and the broader policies that had torn children away from their families and communities. The stories they told were heartbreaking in their similarity. Children forbidden to speak their native languages, forced to abandon traditional spiritual practices, punished for maintaining any connection to their cultural heritage, and often subjected to physical and psychological abuse that amounted to torture. Many families had never seen their children again after they were taken to distant schools, told only that the young people had died or had chosen to remain in white society rather than return to their primitive communities. Jonas and Ayanna watched from his porch as the council proceeded with the dignity and gravity appropriate to such momentous proceedings. The speakers included not just tribal leaders and war chiefs, but also parents who had lost children, traditional healers who had seen their knowledge and practices declared illegal, and even some young people who had survived the school system and returned to their communities with stories of institutional brutality and cultural suppression. Each testimony was received with respectful attention and ritual acknowledgement, creating a comprehensive record of systematic abuse that could not be dismissed as the complaints of a few disgruntled individuals or families. What made the council particularly powerful was its inclusiveness. Representatives from traditionally hostile tribes had set aside their differences to focus on the larger threat to all Native American peoples posed by federal assimilation policies. The presence of so many different communities, speaking dozens of different languages but united in their determination to protect their children and preserve their cultures, created a political force that would be impossible for government officials to ignore or suppress through their usual tactics of divide and conquer. As the morning progressed, the focus of the council shifted from testimony about past injuries to planning for future action. The evidence that Ayanna had collected would be formally presented to the gathering, creating hundreds of witnesses who could testify to its authenticity and significance. But more importantly, the council would establish formal protocols for sharing information about government activities, coordinating resistance to harmful policies, and providing mutual support for families and communities that came under pressure for refusing to surrender their children to federal education programs. The transformation of Jonas's isolated ranch into the site of such a historically significant gathering was not lost on participants or on Jonas himself. His simple act of providing sanctuary to a desperate young woman had created ripple effects that were reshaping the political landscape of the American Southwest. The solitary hermit who had spent 23 years avoiding involvement in the outside world had become the unwitting host for an event that would influence federal Indian policy for decades to come. During a break in the formal proceedings, several tribal leaders approached Jonas's porch to formally acknowledge his role in protecting Ayanna and facilitating the preservation of evidence that was crucial to their cause. They spoke of adoption into their communities, of permanent protection for his ranch and person, and of the honor that came with being recognized as a friend to all Native American peoples in their struggle for survival and justice. By midday, the smoke from the cooking fires of 700 Native Americans had become visible for miles across the desert, creating a signal that could not be ignored by federal authorities who had been tracking Ayanna's movements and were now converging on Monument Valley with orders to arrest her and recover the documents she had stolen from Carlisle School. The response was swift and overwhelming. Territorial marshals, federal agents, and even a detachment of cavalry from Fort Defiance were mobilized to deal with what officials characterized as a potentially hostile gathering that threatened the peace and security of the entire region. But as the government forces approached Monument Valley and saw the true scope of the Native American Assembly, their confidence in their ability to simply arrest one young woman and disperse a few protesters began to evaporate. What they found was not a ragtag group of malcontents, but a carefully organized and disciplined gathering that represented a unified will of dozens of tribal communities. The implications for any attempt to use force were immediately apparent. Violence against such a gathering would likely trigger the largest Native American uprising since the Indian Wars, with consequences that could destabilize the entire territorial system. The federal commander, Colonel William Hayes, was an experienced frontier officer who understood both the military and political dimensions of the situation he faced. He could see that direct confrontation with the assembled tribes would result in a massacre that would outrage public opinion throughout the United States and provide ammunition for critics of federal Indian policy who were already questioning the morality and effectiveness of current approaches to Native American affairs. Instead of ordering an immediate assault, Hayes requested permission to negotiate with the tribal leaders, hoping to find a peaceful resolution that would allow the government to save face while avoiding the political catastrophe that would result from violence against such a large and well-organized gathering. The negotiations that followed were unlike any that had previously occurred between federal authorities and Native American representatives, partly because of the unprecedented unity displayed by the assembled tribes and partly because of the moral authority that came with their possession of documented evidence of government crimes against their children and communities. Jonas found himself serving as an unofficial mediator in these discussions. His status as a host of the gathering and his obvious respect among the tribal leaders giving him a unique position to facilitate communication between parties who had little trust for each other and radically different understandings of justice, law, and proper government. The tribal representatives made it clear that they were not seeking violent confrontation, but they were also absolutely determined to ensure that Ayanna would be allowed to present her evidence to appropriate federal authorities, and that the broader issues of cultural destruction and child abuse in government schools would be addressed through legitimate legal channels rather than simply suppressed through intimidation and violence. Colonel Hayes, meanwhile, was operating under orders that reflected the government's desperation to prevent the exposure of systematic abuses that could undermine the entire federal approach to Native American affairs. His superiors in Washington were less concerned with justice than with maintaining the political fiction that federal education programs were beneficial to Native American communities and represented humanitarian efforts rather than cultural genocide disguised as charity. The standoff continued through the afternoon as both sides weighed their options and considered the consequences of various courses of action. The Native American representatives had the advantage of moral authority, superior numbers, and detailed knowledge of the terrain, but they also understood that any violence would be used to justify even harsher government policies and would likely result in devastating retaliation against their communities. The federal forces had legal authority and superior weapons, but they also faced a political reality that massacring 700 Native Americans would create a scandal that could reach all the way to Congress and potentially result in investigations that would expose the very crimes they were trying to hide. As the sun began to set over Monument Valley, painting the ancient red rocks in their daily display of gold and crimson splendor, the unprecedented gathering reached a resolution that would reshape federal Indian policy and establish new precedents for relations between Native American communities and the United States government. The breakthrough came when Ayanna formally presented her evidence to the assembled council, creating hundreds of witnesses who could testify to the systematic abuses that had been documented at Carlisle School and other federal institutions. The decision by Colonel Hayes to allow this presentation rather than attempting to arrest Ayanna by force represented a pragmatic recognition that violence would create more problems than it solved, but also established important precedents about the rights of Native American communities to organize, to present grievances through formal channels, and to expect respectful treatment from federal authorities. The evidence that Ayanna had preserved was devastating in its scope and detail, providing documentation of crimes that range from cultural suppression to physical abuse to the deliberate separation of children from their families for purposes that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with destroying tribal identity and cohesion. The photographs, documents, and sacred objects she had rescued from destruction created a comprehensive record that could not be dismissed or explained away by government officials who had previously been able to deny such abuses because no evidence had been available to contradict their claims. But perhaps more importantly, the unified response of so many different tribal communities demonstrated a level of organization and political sophistication that federal authorities had consistently underestimated. The gathering in Monument Valley proved that Native American peoples were capable of coordinating their efforts across traditional boundaries, sharing information through networks that operated independently of government control, and mobilizing resources for collective action when their fundamental interests were threatened. The formal agreement that emerged from the day-long negotiations included several components that would have lasting impact on federal Indian policy. Ayanna would be granted safe passage to Washington, D.C., where she would present her evidence to congressional investigators who had been demanding accountability for federal education programs. The sacred objects she had preserved would be returned to their rightful tribal communities through a process that acknowledged their spiritual significance and cultural importance. Most significantly, the federal government would establish new oversight mechanisms for Indian schools, including regular inspections by independent observers and formal procedures for investigating complaints about abuse or cultural suppression. Jonas's role in facilitating these historic agreements earned him formal recognition from both the tribal communities and federal authorities, though he remained characteristically modest about his contributions to what had become one of the most significant peaceful resolutions of Native American grievances in the history of the territories. His isolated ranch had become a symbol of the possibility for understanding and cooperation between peoples who had been taught to view each other as enemies. And his simple act of providing sanctuary to a desperate young woman had created ripples that would benefit Native American communities throughout the country. As the great gathering began to disperse, with representatives returning to their home communities carrying news of what had been accomplished and plans for implementing the new agreements, Jonas and Ayanna stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the monument rocks in their eternal display of beauty and endurance. The 700 Native Americans who had surrounded his ranch in silence had departed as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the memory of their presence and the knowledge that sometimes the most profound changes come not through violence, but through the patient determination of good people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Years later, when Ayanna had become a nationally recognized advocate for Native American rights and Jonas had gained fame as the hermit rancher whose hospitality had changed history, they would both remember this moment as the beginning of a new understanding between peoples who had been divided by fear and prejudice, but who had found common ground in their shared commitment to protecting the innocent and preserving the cultural heritage that gives meaning to human existence.